if you have any questions, put them in the chat as I go along. I'll try to show you some good pictures along the way as well with this. But what we are looking at today is the Civil War, how it affects the soldiers in both of the armies, as well as some of the major battles in the first few years of the war in the western part of the United States and the eastern part of the United States. So we start here with looking at the soldiers. Most of the soldiers in the Civil War were between the ages of 18 and 30. That's the majority of them. Much like, the U.S. Army that we have today, most of those soldiers are going to fall in between those ages. The youngest person on record to enlist was 11, and the oldest was 83. So a wide variety of people choose to enlist in the Army. The majority of these people were not, trained soldiers or big people that are into military life. Majority of them were farmers. German and Irish immigrants made up the largest ethnic group. Mostly those immigrants are going to be fighting for the Union Army, because if you remember, most of the cities that have the factories are all in the north, and immigrants come to the United States in the 1800s to find new jobs and new opportunities, and most of those opportunities are going to be in those factories in those northern cities. So their alliances fall more closely with the Union and the North. African Americans at the beginning of the Civil War were not allowed to fight, but as the war continues, the Union Army does accept African American volunteers. If we look at the numbers that we're looking at, about 3 million men fought in the Civil War, 2 million on the Union side and 1 million on the Confederate side. So the Union does have a substantial advantage when it comes to numbers of soldiers. But if you remember, we also looked at advantages that the Confederate Army had, and that lines up with the Confederate Army had more military expertise, better generals, and just better strategists in terms of how to fight, how to go about fighting. And they're also in that defensive mode, which is a little bit easier to defend that territory instead of going in and pushing into enemy territory. Most of these soldiers are fighting for the love of their country in terms of the United States, or fighting for the state that they live in. So the people in the South, much more geared towards fighting for their state. They also are looking for excitement, for glory, and for money. So all of these different aspects definitely play into this. If you think about recent history for these men that are in between the ages of 18 and 30 during the 1860s, some of them might have been too young to go to the West to seek out glory and fame for the gold rush or any of those things. And most all of them are too young to have been involved in the Mexican-American War. So they might hear information from their fathers or their grandfathers about the fighting in the West and all of those things that they are maybe hoping to get a taste of. And some of them might not really be aware of what they are truly getting in themselves into. The Civil War is very different than any of the wars that the Americans have fought in up until this point, and it really does kick off a lot of aspects of a modern war. The trench warfare is going to be something that first appears here in the Civil War. Some of the weaponry that we see is going to be the first kind of glimpse into a modern war. It is common to take it was common to take clothing, boots, and other supplies off of the dead, just simply because both sides had very poor quality uniforms. They wore out quickly, and there just was not a lot of supplies. So they really often do scavenge and steal from others and also from the dead in and after those battles. So as the war continued, food becomes scarce, especially in the CSA. Let me go here to some of these pictures that I can show you. We'll zoom in here a little bit. So this first picture up here, you can kind of get an idea of the Union and Confederate Army uniforms. On the left, you have a gray Confederate uniform. On the right, you have the navy blue of the Union. So that's kind of just a visual representation of what you're looking at as far as the Army uniforms for each side. Going on to medical knowledge during the Civil War, especially at the beginning of the Civil War. This medical knowledge is still relatively primitive. Very poor hygiene during surgeries, amputations, any sort of medical procedure, but also just in the camps themselves. There wasn't a lot of resources or the time, or people just didn't really know about, making sure that they wash themselves properly and constantly to make sure that the diseases do not spread through the camp. And unfortunately for these soldiers, the main cause of death is going to be disease in the camps and after battles, in terms of an infection or gangrene or anything like that. And more soldiers die from disease than actually on the battlefield. So if we look at these pictures again, I found some of the surgical equipment that would be typical of a Civil War surgeon on the field. So obviously these are pretty gnarly looking instruments. You have a huge bone saw that's going to be used to, cut through bone, to just kind of hack off a limb if you can. You also have tools to get bullets out, remove things from inside anybody, and just imagine laying on a hospital table and your doctor comes in with his wooden case and he opens it up and he's like, okay, this is what I got. I got this huge saw and these big old knives, and that's what we're going to try to get you better with. Oh, you got something that needs to be pulled out? Well, let me just stick these pliers within you and pull that out as best I can. So these instruments, they're not being sterilized each time. They're not being washed and cleaned each time. They're not practicing that hygiene that we would expect to see in a hospital currently. So what you get is, if you go in and you have to have something, sewn up or stitched up or whatever, disease is going to be in that wound, and there's no antibiotics, there's no disinfectant, there's nothing like that is just going to lead to more infection and more death after that. So something to think about, that it's not just all about the death on the battlefield, but also in these camps and in these wartime hospitals in the Civil War was very difficult for the soldiers. Prison camps also were established at this time. And on each of those sides, prison camps and hospitals, we actually have a pretty significant historical piece in the state of Missouri as far as those prison camps and prison hospitals go. And that's in St. Louis, and it's Jefferson Barracks is what that is called. This is Jefferson Barracks today. So these buildings, some of them are original from all the way back in 1826, but all of them have been used as either hospital grounds or prisons as during the Civil War. So this is kind of some of that Civil War history that we have here in our own state as well. And these buildings are still here. You can go and you can see them. They have museums and stuff in them, but it also serves as a military cemetery. So this is an image from Jefferson Barracks. You can see all the tombstones and stuff. And if you actually go there, there are sections of Jefferson Barracks that have specifically Confederate soldiers buried in them. You can drive by and see their actual tombstones all the way back from the 1860s. So it is a very interesting place to be, and to kind of make that situation real. Those people that were in those camps, in those prison camps, in those hospitals, are buried alongside, people from World War I, World War II, and all the way up through the present day. So Jefferson Barracks, if you ever get into St. Louis, very interesting place to go. On both sides, captured soldiers faced horrible conditions in prison camps: little shelter, inadequate food, filthy drinking water, caused thousands to die in these prison camps. So moral of the story is, being a soldier is not easy no matter what time period you are in, but being a soldier in the Civil War was especially trying. You also did have new advanced military techniques, which actually increased the death. So if you just, in the American Revolution, we have maybe long rifles that are not really very accurate. They don't shoot at a high rate. So you shoot, you might miss, you might hit, but it probably is going to result in probably not killing anybody. The odds were not really good that you would actually do that. So this, in the Civil War, accuracy and the precision and just the speed at which you can reload and fire goes up. So more casualties are going to result from that. Railroads allowed troops, supplies, and weapons to be moved quickly. This, along with rifle and mini ball, increase the accuracy. It makes the cavalry charge and frontal assaults, they just didn't work as well, because if you, in past wars, when cavalry with their horses and everything, they would ride in, it was very unlikely that the opposing side would be able to actually fire on them and stop them from advancing. But now, since it's more accurate, it changes the way these wars are fought, because you can't just march into the other army like we see in the American Revolution and other wars. You now have to plan other tactics, and you get kind of set in your position, and that's when trenches start to be dug, cannons start to be fortified, and you get kind of that lobbing back and forth of firing charges. So if we look at some of these other images that I have, we'll get to those in just a second, but this is where you would see maybe the trenches being dug, the cannons being positioned in those trenches. And then we also have just some of the different weapons in the Civil War. We do get the first introductions of common use of the grenades, where instead of just having artillery from cannons, you were actually able to take things and throw them by hand, which obviously is then again going to cause more death and destruction. Another image of more of these long rifles that are much more accurate, much more deadly in terms of the accuracy and the speed at which you can reload and fire. So we move on to grenades. Like I just said, trenches we've already talked about. Both sides did start to build these ironclad ships. These are powered by steam, and they're protected by iron plates. The ships were fast, they were powerful, and they had the capability of just slicing right through a wooden ship. So they could just, without even firing a cannon shot or anything like that, they could just drive right through the old style wooden ships and basically just destroy them without much of a problem. The most famous sea battle during the Civil War was between the Monitor and the Merrimack, or the Virginia, and it did end in a draw. This is kind of an image of those ships going head to head, the Virginia and the Monitor. So obviously both of them are made out of steel, iron sides. That's ironclad ships. Protect the ships and protect people inside makes it very difficult to actually take them down, and that's why both sides were pretty evenly matched, and that's why it was ended up in a draw. So the next few slides, we're going to look at the war in the West and in the East. In the West, we're going to focus on Ulysses S. Grant. One of his sayings is find out where your enemy is, get at him as soon as you can, strike at him as hard as you can, and then keep moving. That is his strategy. That is how he approaches war, and that's how he approaches this war, the Civil War in the West. In February of 1862, Grant moved to capture the Tennessee River. He captures two Confederate forts, Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, using ironclads. So in the Tennessee River, he is able to use this new technology of the ironclads to actually capture these forts. This allows the North to control the river traffic all the way down to Alabama. And allows the Union forces to capture Nashville, Tennessee, which was an important area for the Confederates. So if we go down here, this is Ulysses S. Grant is down here. This is also another picture of him over here. So if we look at, back it out just a little bit. If we look at the war in the West, what you see is that this is the Tennessee River right through here. What he is essentially doing is cutting off all of this area from the rest of the South towards the coast. So he is able to go through, take all of these areas, and then control Nashville as well. So this is going to be important to focus on, because what we see here is Ulysses S. Grant moving from place to place quickly and efficiently, and actually capturing places and pushing everyone else out. That is going to be in direct contrast to what we see in the East. So just keep that in mind. The Battle of Shiloh, let me show you it on the map. Battle of Shiloh is right here, where kind of all these arrows are kind of meeting together. Battle at Shiloh is one of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War. Confederate troops under General Albert Johnston surprised Union Generals Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman. Grant was able to defeat General Pierce Beauregard when reinforcements arrived. The Union loses 13,000 of 65,000 men who fought, and the Confederates lost 11,000 of the 41,000 that they had. This leads to kind of outrage in Congress, in the United States Congress. The amount of loss of life gets Grant into trouble, even though technically they win the battle. The Congress is unhappy with the amount of people that are dying, and a lot of people want Grant to be fired. But Abraham Lincoln sees that Grant is really having some successes, and he is necessary for the war effort, and he refuses to fire him by saying, basically, I can't spare him. He actually goes and fights. So that's going to play in the later parts of the war as well, and it really shows you what Lincoln values out of a general, and what that is going to lead to a problem with another general. April 1862, a Union fleet led by Admiral David Farragut captured. Sorry, it's like cut off. Let me get that up here for you. Captured New Orleans, getting the Union one victory from dividing the South into two. So if we look back at this map, you can see him coming into New Orleans, cutting the South into two. What they really want to do is separate Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana from the rest of the South. So they are essentially very close to doing that. And that has kind of been their ultimate goal for the first part of the war. So what the successes in the West are kind of contrasted by a lot of failures in the East for the Union Army. In the Union Army, General George McClellan is the commander, and he, after that first battle of Bull Run, that loss of a whole bunch of life and just a loss to the Confederates, he regroups, reorganizes, retrains the army into one that could defeat those Confederates. He takes them more seriously. He understands this is what needs to happen. But the main issue with McClellan, as Lincoln put it, is that he had the slows, which means that he was unwilling to take a risk. He was unwilling to kind of put that final nail in the coffin for the Confederates. He seems to always kind of let them slip away, and then they are able to go regroup, and the Confederates are able to go and get a little bit stronger and come back. So in spring of 1862, McClellan starts the Peninsula Campaign to try to capture Richmond, Virginia, which is, again, a very important area for the Confederates. And if you can capture that, you have a good shot of being able to win the war completely. McClellan and the United States Army reaches the outskirts of the city, but he pauses his offensive, and he is unwilling to risk troops. He's unwilling to put more troops in harm's way. And that pause ultimately leads to the Confederates being able to regroup and keeping them out of Richmond. So it allows them to do this because it allows the new commander of the Confederate Army, Robert E. Lee, to regroup and scout out McClellan's positions. Lee then goes and engages McClellan's army in what will become known as the 7 Days Battle. The Confederates suffer 20,000 casualties to the Union's 15,000, but the only reason that this battle even takes place is because George McClellan and the Union Army stops, and he has that case of the slows, and he's unwilling to risk it, and he is forced to retreat, ending the Union threat to capture the Confederate capital of Richmond. So this is George McClellan right here. This is Robert E. Lee right here. And if we look at McClellan's plan in the East, what we have is, if you look at the map and you try to understand that Richmond is right here. So McClellan has basically gone down through here. He marches up through here, but just outside of Richmond, he hesitates and waits because he doesn't want to push fully through. And Lee, being an excellent military general, scouts that plan out and then goes out and starts this 7 days battle, which ultimately forces McClellan to retreat. The issue here now is that Robert E. Lee, all these other battles in this area happen after the 7 days battle, and now McClellan is kind of on the run and is kind of on his retreat path. So it allows Robert E. Lee to kind of have a lot more success. So with this success, Robert E. Lee kind of sees an opportunity, and with victories at the 7 days and the second Battle of Bull Run, Lee decides to push forward and actually invade the North. This is a change in the Confederate strategy of purely defending their home turf, and now it is going into, hey, let's try to actually capture this area. Lee's reasons for taking the war to the north into Maryland. So if you look at, just to give you an idea of what we're talking about. So the war's been kind of fighting down here, and what Lee wants to do is push it up into Maryland, into Northern Territory. So this is really where we are trying to get right here. At the end of this, we'll go to the battle at Teenham. So this changes from a defensive strategy to an offensive strategy. He's hoping that a victory in the North might force Lincoln into peace talks, not necessarily that they would be able to overtake and capture all of the northern states, but it would force Abraham Lincoln to say, okay, we're done fighting. The Confederate States of America can be their own country, and that'll just be it. The invasion would give Virginia farmers a rest from the war during the harvest season. So he's hoping to get out of Virginia, go into the North, get the fighting out of there, because when everything is going on in your state, you can't farm, you can't do any of the things that you really need to do. The Confederates could steal from northern farms for food, which they desperately needed. Lee hoped a victory in the North would convince Britain and France to recognize the Confederacy and help them with aid. The plans of Lee's battle were left in a Confederate camp, and Union soldiers found those plans, and this gives McClellan a chance to stop Confederates. So he does at Antietam, or called Sharpsburg. He essentially, Robert E. Lee's plan is to go much farther north than this. But because they are able to capture those plans and know what's going on, McClellan is able to cut him off here at Antietam or at Sharpsburg, and it stops him from advancing. Now, this is the single deadliest day of the war. 23,000 Americans died in this battle, all in one day. Lee loses a fourth of his troops and was forced to retreat back to Virginia. Now, that might sound like a really big victory for the Union and for George McClellan, but he could have continued to fight and push forward and chase Robert E. Lee and continue to do whatever he could to force Robert E. Lee to surrender, but instead he leaves it to Robert E. Lee. He is able to escape. He misses this potential chance of ending the Civil War completely. He has a decisive victory here. George McClellan has a decisive victory where Lee is on the retreat and can go and do nothing but run, and McClellan lets him run and lets him escape. This really frustrates Abraham Lincoln. This is kind of the last straw because, in his eyes, he's let two golden opportunities go by. He hesitates outside of Richmond. They aren't able to get the capital city of the South captured. And then he hesitates here and lets Lee escape, which if he didn't, he could have ended the war in 1862. And this war is not going to end in 1862. It goes on for at least 3 more years. So Abraham Lincoln fires George McClellan in November of 1862, and it really, no side right now is in a good position. The North has had some victories, the South has some victories, but each of them have had losses, and each of them have lost a lot of men during these battles. So that is it for lesson 2. Remember, if you have any questions, please make sure you message any of the teachers that are here. Stick around. We will be answering as many of those as we can. And if you